She woke one morning as the co-ruler of the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean and went to sleep that night as a fugitive running for her life across the desert. Cleopatra VII was 21 years old, and her 13-year-old brother had just signed the order for her execution. The year was 49 BC, and the Ptolemaic tradition of sibling murder was about to claim another victim. Except this time, the victim refused to die quietly. For 18 months, Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XX had ruled Egypt together as co-regents, following their father's will and the ancient Egyptian custom of sibling marriage that the Greek Ptolemies had adopted to legitimize their dynasty. But co-rule was a fiction, and everyone in Alexandria knew it. The real power belonged to whoever controlled the boy king, and the three men who controlled him, the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achilles, and the rhetorician Theodotus, had no intention of sharing that power with an ambitious older sister who refused to defer to their authority. They had spent months undermining her, countermanding her orders, spreading rumors about her instability and unfitness to rule. Now they had convinced Ptolemy to take the final step, to expel his sister from Egypt and claim sole authority for himself. Cleopatra fled east with a handful of loyal followers, knowing that if she stayed within reach of her brother's forces, she would end up like her sister Berenice, strangled, beheaded, erased from history. But she did not flee to safety and retirement. She fled to Syria to raise an army because she understood something that her brother's advisors had fatally underestimated. This was not over. This was just beginning. Before we follow Cleopatra into exile and examine how she turned defeat into victory, we need to understand the poisonous family dynamics that made this conflict inevitable and the three men who orchestrated it. If you find stories of sibling rivalry and deadly power struggles compelling, consider subscribing to join us as we explore more of history's forgotten conflicts. The Ptolemaic dynasty had a well-earned reputation as the most murderous royal family in the ancient world. The dynasty began with Ptolemy the Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who claimed Egypt after Alexander's death in 323 BC. But ruling that kingdom required constant vigilance against the most dangerous enemies, your own relatives. Ptolemaic succession followed no clear rules. Older sons might inherit, or younger sons if they were more ruthless. Daughters could rule as queens or as co-rulers with their brothers. Multiple siblings might share power temporarily until one eliminated the others. The only constant was violence. Cleopatra's family history read like a catalog of atrocities. Her great-great-great-grandmother had murdered her own son's wife. Ptolemy Thwine himself, Cleopatra's father, was ruthless when it came to family. When his daughter Berenice IV seized the throne during his exile, Ptolemy returned with Roman legions and had her executed. Some sources say strangled, others beheaded. This was the household in which Cleopatra grew up, where love was dangerous and trust was fatal. The will of Ptolemy XX, opened after his death in 51 BC, tried to prevent the usual succession bloodbath by establishing a co-regency. His eldest surviving daughter, Cleopatra VII, then 18 years old, would rule jointly with her brother Ptolemy, then 10 years old, and they would marry according to Egyptian tradition to legitimize their shared rule. On paper, this seemed like a reasonable compromise that gave both siblings legitimate authority. In practice, it was a recipe for disaster. Cleopatra was an adult, educated, capable, and ambitious. She had been groomed to rule and had the intelligence and determination to do it well. Ptolemy was a child who would be controlled by whatever faction could dominate his regency council. The real question was not whether Cleopatra and Ptolemy would rule together harmoniously, but which sibling's faction would win the inevitable power struggle. The three men who formed Ptolemy XIII's regency council were not officials who happened to be thrust into power. They were experienced operators who had served under Ptolemy XIII and understood how the Ptolemaic court actually functioned. Pothinus was the royal treasurer and the king's chief minister, a eunuch who had risen to power through financial competence and political ruthlessness. In the Ptolemaic court, eunuchs often held positions of great trust because they could not found their own dynasties and therefore posed less long-term threat to the ruling family. Pothinus had managed Egypt's treasury through the chaotic final years of Ptolemy Authoni's reign, maintaining financial stability despite the enormous costs of Roman bribes and military expeditions. He was not merely a bureaucrat, but a political strategist who understood power and how to acquire it. Achilles commanded the royal army, 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, the military force that would decide any physical confrontation. He was a professional soldier who had risen through the ranks, respected by his troops and feared by his enemies. Military command in the Ptolemaic system meant more than tactical competence. It meant controlling the only force that could impose order on a fractious kingdom or defend against external threats. Achilles knew that whoever held the loyalty of the army held real power in Egypt, and he intended to use that power to maintain his position regardless of which Ptolemy sat on the throne. Theodotus was Ptolemy's tutor, a rhetorician from Chios, who provided the intellectual justification for whatever policies the Regency Council wanted to pursue. In ancient courts, tutors wielded enormous influence because they shaped the thinking of young rulers during their most formative years. Theodotus had access to Ptolemy III from childhood, teaching him what to think about power, legitimacy, and proper governance. He was also the council's spokesman, the one who could articulate their positions in ways that sounded principled rather than self-serving. Together, these three men controlled the young king completely. They decided what he heard, what he read, who he met, what orders were issued in his name. They were, in effect, the rulers of Egypt, and Cleopatra represented the only serious threat to their power. The conflict began almost immediately after Ptolemy X's death. Cleopatra, as the older and more capable sibling, assumed that she would be the senior partner in the co-regency. She issued orders in her own name, placed her portrait on coins, and conducted diplomatic business without consulting the Regency Council. This was not unreasonable. She was an adult ruler dealing with a child co-regent who needed guidance, not a partner who needed to share power equally. But the Regency Council saw her independence as a direct threat to their authority. If Cleopatra established herself as the dominant ruler, they would be reduced to advisors rather than the real power behind the throne. They began a systematic campaign to undermine her authority, countermanding her orders, spreading rumors about her judgment and stability, and gradually isolating her from the levers of power that actually controlled the kingdom. The propaganda they deployed against Cleopatra reveals their strategy. They portrayed her as mentally unstable, too emotional to govern effectively, prone to impulsive decisions. They emphasized her youth and her gender, suggesting that a young woman could not manage the complex demands of ruling Egypt. They accused her of plotting to murder her brother, which was almost certainly untrue, but was believed because it fit the Ptolemaic pattern. They presented Ptolemy III as the legitimate heir needing protection from his dangerous older sister. This narrative was self-serving, but effective because it appealed to existing prejudices about female rulers. By the summer of 49 BC, the Regency Council felt strong enough to make their move. They convinced Ptolemy XIII to sign an order expelling Cleopatra from Alexandria and stripping her of all authority. The official charge was treason, though no specific acts were identified. The real reason was simple. Cleopatra refused to accept their authority. The expulsion order was also, implicitly, a death warrant. If Cleopatra remained within reach of the royal army, she would be arrested and executed. The precedent of Berenice IV made this clear. Ptolemies who lost power struggles did not retire peacefully. They died, usually quickly and often brutally. Cleopatra's flight from Alexandria was hasty and desperate. She could not take a large retinue or bring significant treasure. She needed to move quickly before the Regency Council's agents could intercept her. She headed east across the Sinai Peninsula with a small group of loyal followers, servants who were willing to risk their lives following a deposed queen with an uncertain future. The journey was dangerous and degrading. Cleopatra had been raised in palaces, surrounded by luxury and deference. Now she was fleeing like a criminal, traveling through desert wastes, dependent on the loyalty of people who might betray her at any moment for a reward. But she survived the journey and reached Syria, where she began the seemingly impossible task of raising an army that could challenge her brother's control of Egypt. The resources available to Cleopatra were minimal. She had some jewelry that could be sold or pawned, some loyal followers who believed in her cause, and her own intelligence and determination. She did not have a treasury, an established military force, or powerful allies willing to commit troops to restore her. Syria was Roman territory, and the Roman governor had no interest in involving himself in an Egyptian succession dispute that might draw Rome into an expensive and pointless conflict. The various client kings and local potentates of the region were sympathetic but cautious. Supporting a deposed queen was risky if she lost, and Cleopatra's prospects did not look good. She needed to convince mercenaries to fight for a cause that seemed hopeless, commanders to trust her leadership despite her youth and gender, and suppliers to extend credit that might never be repaid. The fact that she succeeded in assembling any army at all testifies to her persuasive abilities and her refusal to accept defeat. While Cleopatra was recruiting mercenaries in Syria, the situation in Alexandria was deteriorating in ways that her brother's advisors had not anticipated. The Regency Council was competent at palace intrigue, but less capable at actual governance. They raised taxes to pay for military expansion, alienating the Egyptian population. They debased the currency to cover their expenditures, causing inflation and economic disruption. They picked fights with neighboring states and refused diplomatic compromises that might have preserved Egyptian interests. The kingdom that had been relatively stable under Ptolemy Thukali's weak but non-confrontational rule became increasingly unstable as the Regency Council pursued aggressive policies that they thought demonstrated strength but actually revealed their lack of judgment. The Egyptian priests who had supported the Ptolemaic dynasty for centuries began to question whether Ptolemy Thukali's government was legitimate and whether Cleopatra might be preferable. The Roman Civil War that erupted between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great in 49 BC created both danger and opportunity for Egypt. The Regency Council understood that Egypt's position in the Mediterranean world depended entirely on maintaining good relations with whichever Roman faction emerged victorious. They bet on Pompey, who had helped restore Ptolemy the to his throne years earlier and seemed the safer choice as an established member of the Roman elite. But this bet required them to navigate carefully. Supporting Pompey too openly might antagonize Caesar if he won, while not supporting him enough might offend Pompey if he remained dominant. The Regency Council chose a strategy of minimal involvement, providing some supplies and nominal support to Pompey without committing Egyptian forces to battle. This seemed prudent at the time, but would prove disastrous when circumstances changed. The Battle of Pharsalus in August 48 BC destroyed Pompey's army and left Caesar as the undisputed master of the Roman world. Pompey fled east, desperately seeking refuge somewhere beyond Caesar's reach. He made the fatal mistake of sailing to Egypt, expecting sanctuary from the kingdom his earlier support had preserved. When his ships appeared off the Egyptian coast in late September 48 BC, the Regency Council faced a decision that would determine Egypt's future and their own survival. They could offer Pompey sanctuary, which might anger Caesar and invite Roman intervention. They could turn him away, which might work if Caesar was willing to let the matter drop, but would guarantee Pompey's enmity if he somehow recovered his position. Or they could eliminate Pompey entirely, removing him as a factor, and presenting Caesar with a gift that supposedly demonstrated Egyptian loyalty to the winning side. The Regency Council chose murder. They sent a boat to Pompey's ship with Achillas and 2 Roman soldiers who had once served under Pompey, inviting him to come ashore for a meeting with the young king. Pompey's wife Cornelia watched from the deck as her husband climbed into the boat. She watched as the assassins drew their swords and stabbed him repeatedly before he could even react. She watched as they dumped his body in the surf and cut off his head for presentation to Caesar. The Regency Council congratulated themselves on a masterstroke of realpolitik. They had eliminated Caesar's enemy, demonstrated their usefulness to Roman power, and positioned themselves as loyal allies who deserved support. They completely failed to understand Roman values or Roman psychology, and their miscalculation would cost them everything. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria on October 248 BC, 4 days after Pompey's murder. He came with a relatively small force, 4,000 legionaries and 800 cavalry, because he had pursued Pompey so quickly that the bulk of his army had not caught up. The Regency Council expected gratitude for the gift they were about to present. Instead, Caesar was horrified and disgusted. Theodotus brought Pompey's severed head to Caesar's quarters, expecting praise and reward. Caesar turned away and wept. Pompey had been his enemy at the end. Yes, but he had also been Caesar's son-in-law, married to Caesar's daughter Julia before her death in childbirth. He had been a fellow Roman senator, a man of noble rank who deserved a dignified death and proper funeral rites. The Egyptians had treated him like a criminal, murdered him in the most cowardly fashion imaginable, and now presented his rotting head as if they expected thanks. Caesar was reportedly furious at this barbaric treatment of a Roman noble and disgusted by the presumption of the Egyptians who thought he would approve. This was the moment when Cleopatra's opportunity crystallized. Caesar was in Alexandria, holding the power to decide the succession dispute between her and her brother. He was angry at the Regency Council for murdering Pompey. He needed Egypt's cooperation and resources, but had no obligation to support the current government. The problem was that Cleopatra was trapped outside the city with no way to reach Caesar before her brother's advisors could present their version of events and poison him against her. The guards at every entrance to the palace had orders to kill her on sight. She needed a way to bypass those guards, reach Caesar privately, and make her case before the Regency Council could prevent the meeting. The solution she devised has become one of the most famous stories in ancient history: the rolled carpet, carried into Caesar's chambers after dark, unrolled to reveal the fugitive queen who had gambled everything on one audacious move. The carpet entrance was not romantic or seductive in the way later propaganda would suggest. It was desperate, practical, and brilliant. Cleopatra understood that her only chance was to speak directly to Caesar, that once she had his attention, she could make a case based on strategic logic rather than emotion. She also understood that the first impression mattered enormously, that arriving in a memorable and audacious fashion would establish her as someone extraordinary, rather than just another supplicant seeking favor. The carpet gambit worked because it demonstrated exactly the qualities that Caesar valued: courage, creativity, willingness to take enormous risks for high stakes. When Apollodorus unrolled that carpet and Cleopatra emerged to face Caesar, she was not presenting herself as a beauty or a seductress. She was presenting herself as someone clever enough and desperate enough to do whatever was necessary to survive. The conversation that followed lasted the entire night and resulted in Caesar's decision to support Cleopatra's claim to the throne. The ancient sources do not record what arguments she made or what promises she offered, but we can infer the outline. She would have pointed out that the Regency Council had mishandled Egypt's finances and foreign relations, that their murder of Pompey demonstrated poor judgment and barbaric values, that they could not be trusted to maintain the Roman alliance or deliver the grain shipments that Rome desperately needed. She would have positioned herself as the more capable ruler, the one who could restore stability and ensure Egyptian cooperation with Roman interests. She would have offered legitimacy. If Caesar imposed a ruler on Egypt by force, that ruler would always be seen as a Roman puppet. But if he adjudicated a legitimate succession dispute and found in her favor based on the merits, she would rule with genuine authority. The argument worked because it was true. Cleopatra was more capable than her brother, more intelligent than his advisors, and more likely to be an effective ally. Caesar's solution was to restore the joint rule that Ptolemy XIII's will had specified, with both Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII recognized as legitimate co-rulers. This looked like a compromise, but was actually a complete victory for Cleopatra. She would be the senior partner because she was older, more capable, and now backed by Caesar's legions. Her brother would be a figurehead at best, a hostage to ensure good behavior at worst. The Regency Council that had controlled him was explicitly sidelined. Pothinus would eventually be executed on Caesar's orders. Achilles would be killed during the fighting that followed, and Theodotus would flee Egypt to avoid the same fate. Within a few months of that October night when Cleopatra emerged from a rolled carpet, she had gone from fugitive exile to undisputed ruler of Egypt, her brother reduced to ceremonial co-regent, her enemies dead or scattered. The Alexandrian War that followed was a consequence of the Regency Council's refusal to accept Caesar's decision. Achilles led the royal army against Caesar's forces, besieging them in the palace quarter of Alexandria. The fighting lasted from October 48 BC until March 47 BC, 5 months of urban warfare that destroyed parts of the city and may have damaged the famous Library of Alexandria when fire spread from burning ships in the harbor. Caesar's military genius and the arrival of reinforcements eventually defeated Achilles and the Egyptian forces. Ptolemy XIII tried to escape by boat, but drowned in the Nile when his overloaded vessel capsized, weighed down by his golden armor. He was 13 years old when he died, a child who had been used as a weapon by ambitious men and discarded when he was no longer useful. Cleopatra became sole ruler of Egypt, though she quickly married her younger brother Ptolemy XIV to maintain the fiction of sibling co-rule and satisfy Egyptian tradition. The sibling war between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII lasted less than 2 years from expulsion to final resolution, but its consequences shaped the rest of Cleopatra's life and the future of Egypt. She had learned that survival required ruthlessness, that family ties meant nothing when power was at stake, that allies could be found in unexpected places if you were clever enough to approach them correctly. She had demonstrated her capability under the worst possible circumstances, going from deposed exile to victorious ruler through a combination of strategic thinking, personal courage, and audacious gambling. She had also tied Egypt's fate to Rome more completely than any previous Ptolemaic ruler, establishing a pattern of alliance and dependency that would define her reign and ultimately doom her kingdom. The 3 men who had orchestrated her expulsion were all dead within a year of Caesar's arrival. Pothinus was executed for continuing to plot against Caesar even after the succession had been decided. Achilles died in battle during the Alexandrian War, killed by his own soldiers after a dispute over strategy. Theodotus fled to Syria, where he was eventually captured and executed by Brutus and Cassius, the men who would later assassinate Caesar. None of them survived to see how completely their gambit had failed, how their attempt to eliminate Cleopatra had instead elevated her to undisputed power and destroyed them entirely. Their miscalculation was not about Cleopatra personally, though they certainly underestimated her, but about the larger strategic situation. They thought they could manipulate the Roman civil war to their advantage, that murdering Pompey would win Caesar's gratitude, that controlling a child king was more valuable than accepting an adult queen. They were wrong on every count, and the price of that error was their kingdom's independence and their own lives. Cleopatra's younger siblings did not fare well either. Ptolemy XIII, who became her co-ruler after Ptolemy XIII's death, died in 44 BC under mysterious circumstances that strongly suggest poisoning. Cleopatra needed him eliminated to clear the way for her son Caesarion to become co-ruler, and Ptolemy XIII conveniently died at exactly the right moment. Arsinoe IV, another younger sister who had briefly been proclaimed queen by rebel forces during the Alexandrian War, was dragged through Rome in Caesar's triumph and later executed on Cleopatra's orders while living in exile in Asia Minor. By 41 BC, Cleopatra had eliminated all potential rivals from her own generation, ensuring that only her children would have any claim to the throne. The Ptolemaic tradition of family murder continued, but now Cleopatra was the one wielding the knife rather than fleeing from it. The sibling war also established the pattern of Roman intervention that would eventually destroy Egyptian independence. Caesar had come to Alexandria by chance, pursuing Pompey rather than seeking to involve himself in Egyptian politics. But once involved, he discovered that Egypt was too important and too unstable to be left alone. Its grain fed Rome, its wealth financed Roman ambitions, its strategic position controlled Eastern Mediterranean trade. Every subsequent crisis in Cleopatra's reign, her relationship with Caesar, her alliance with Mark Antony, her final confrontation with Octavian, was fundamentally about this same issue. Egypt could not be independent because Rome would not allow it to be independent. The best Cleopatra could do was manage the terms of dependency, choosing her Roman allies carefully and trying to preserve as much autonomy as possible while acknowledging the reality of Roman dominance. Looking back, across 2,000 years, the conflict between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII appears almost predestined. The Ptolemaic system guaranteed sibling rivalry and murder. The political situation in 48 BC guaranteed Roman intervention. Cleopatra's intelligence and ambition guaranteed that she would not accept subordination. Every element was in place for exactly the outcome that occurred. Cleopatra's triumph, her brother's death, the Regency Council's destruction, and the beginning of her attempt to preserve Egyptian independence through Roman alliance. The young woman who fled across the desert in 49 BC as a deposed exile could not have imagined how her story would end. But she learned the essential lesson in that sibling war. Survival required constant vigilance, ruthless pragmatism, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary. She survived that first test, and many others after, until finally she faced a test she could not pass. The sibling war was her first real test as a leader, and she passed it through desperation, intelligence, and audacious courage that would characterize her entire reign.